back. In the old days, we used to say that ilikuwa traffic ilikuwa mob. We got stuck at a particular roundabout. Nowadays, I think we have both internet and technology to blame. Let me just check whether, Evans, are you able to come in now? I've just posted on the chat the hashtag. Take a minute as we are waiting for the technology to catch up with us, to just tweet or post Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok if you have the capacity. Okay, I can see connectivity is weak for some. And we'll give this a few more minutes, and then I think we will ask the East African Philanthropy Association to send us all air tickets, and we will reconvene at KICC. I can just declare it now. Let me just see. So if you can hear me, just acknowledge on the chat somebody so that I know. Okay, great. I can be heard in Nyanyuki. Probably is quite impressive, actually. Excellent. Okay. So as we wait for Evans to come in, I'm just going to run through. Let me just do a bit of additional housekeeping and talk you through the program for the next couple of days, just so that we can get that out of the way. So we've got a great session ahead of us. We've got the opening session, and we'll have a couple of speakers, and then we will then move into the plenary. And that plenary is titled Sailing the Disruptive Wave. What does it mean for establishing philanthropy in emerging realities? And of course, our immediate reality is a COVID-19 pandemic, but also an economic recession that is affecting many of our countries. So we've got that plenary session, a couple of speakers. We'll have Becky Moyo, Sasha Fisher, and Jackie Asimue, who will basically take us up to 11 o'clock. We will then turn to the first parallel session, and the parallel sessions are kind of interesting. Like the first one really is a declaration that we have come of age. The community philanthropy, if it was ever thought to have originated somewhere in Ohio with the first community foundation, we are going to declare that it has arrived within this region, and we are going to listen to a couple of people speak about what it looks like and what are the new trends within that. On the second session, in the first parallel set of sessions, we are going to look at grant making from a decolonization lens. How do we increase domestic and local accountability as well as local resource mobilization? And we have two great speakers, Sibongile Ndachi and also Mai Banka, from both ends of the continent. I guess this would be Kwame Nkrumah's from Cape to Cairo. And then that session will be moderated by Andrew Karagai. The parallel session number 3 will look at 3 case studies, and the case studies are essentially from Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, and these are obviously very different political economic systems, very different culturally also. It'll be interesting to see what we can learn from the different contexts in which community philanthropy is being organized. At 12:15, we will take a comfort break, and many of you will have elected to go into the different breakout groups. And we will then at that point have a session on wellness and well-being led by Nelly Kinyanjui. We'll also have at the same time a session on media and philanthropy moderated by Ken Mjungu and 2 speakers, Janet Mbogwa and Hagai Matsiko. At which point we will come back into the plenary at 1:20, and for 10 minutes we will listen to a quick summary of the day by the Chief Executive Officer of the Kilimani Project Foundation, Wanjiru Kanyiha. So I believe we can now proceed to invite Evans to take us through the first of three quick presentations before we go into the summary sessions. East Africa Philanthropy Network. I think the technology is just trying to get me to do an Evans Okinyi stand-up routine. Sorry, folks. Stay with us. Keep tweeting, keep posting, keep sharing where you're calling in from. Welcome, Wendy. Welcome, Vanessa Polisana. I think it's Sarah Kinua. Oh, you can now hear us in Mombasa. That's great. And Vanessa, welcome from Dar es Salaam. Our greetings and gratitude to His Excellency Kikwete. He did a good job in Zambia, and I can see you are from his the foundation that's named after him. And we hope that we can give you another platform for His Excellency to continue doing the work that he does so well. I'm just checking in with the technicians, see what. I'm being informed that we're still trying to connect into the main hub for the conference where Evans is, so they will bring us there fairly soon. Stay with us, and we will kick off in a few minutes or so. Take a minute. Take a minute also to just look at the conference agenda for the next couple of days. Today is really a day about building resilience, being able to weather the complex environment that we've experienced over the last couple of years. And I think for many of us, we have grappled with how do we
watch my fingers. Shall we proceed? Focus on his laptop, not mine. Because mine is refresh all the time.
I believe we're connected again. Fiona, let me just check. Can you hear me from where you are? Okay, great. Thank you. I feel a bit like Malema during the funeral of Winnie Mandela. He says, "Send me a sign." Great, thanks, Daniel. I will turn, just so that we can use the time productively, to the next two days of the meeting.
In 1 minute, we should be off. Anything with the speaker link to Panel presentation.
Invite you to turn down your to mute your microphone. We can hear you on the side.
I hope the other speakers are prepared. Who is it?
If you go there, then that will not the same shooting.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah.
We are so glad to hear from you. I was about to do an impersonation of you.
I'm sorry. We had an issue with our live streaming, and so it became a challenge for us. But here we are, and my very sincere apologies.
Absolute problems, brother. Let me just invite, your microphone is great, but I think we have two microphones on in the same room, so we're getting a bit of an echo. And
Okay.
as yet, we're not able to see you. And after making so many jokes about me impersonating you, I suspect your movement would like to see you personally, if possible. But otherwise, if not, we can just we can kick off. And
thank you, Irungu. Can someone sort my video? So Irungu, just in 1 sec, and my sincere apologies. We should be.
I think most of us are suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome with regards to Zoom meetings. So I didn't mean to use a proprietary term, but webinars have all suffered in the course of this last year. So I'm sure it'll get straight. Welcome, Kwesiga, from the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Thanks for the heart emoji. We feel you. We feel you.
Window.
And welcome, Mary, also from Alui in Tanzania.
Irungu, can you see my screen? No.
Not yet seeing a screen, but can definitely. I think. Are you about to project the presentation? Yes.
That's what we are working on.
The presentation now. We could, and
in one
black screen. We are getting there. Welcome, Alice. We are seeing the beginnings of a PowerPoint, Evans.
Okay. Is it now okay?
Yes, we can see. If you can just project it, I think we're almost there.
Where? Is it okay now?
It looks like it may be coming through. Not yet. If you want to click it again, I mean it's visible, but as yet it seems like your camera, your lens is covered. I believe you're on Mercy's. We can now see you, and we can see the PowerPoint. PowerPoint is not on projection, but it's visible.
They're saying it's loading, though slowly.
That's okay. I feel like that sometimes on a Tuesday morning.
Erungu, maybe if you can hear me for the sake of time, because I have only 7 minutes, we can proceed.
We can hear you.
Thank you. You can hear me, right?
Loud and clear.
Thank you so much. So what I wanted to present was just to enable us kick off the conference in terms of understanding the landscape of philanthropy in East Africa and the preliminary findings of the research that we did is what I wanted to share with us so that it can inform our understanding of how the space looks like and our understanding of some of the emerging trends and practices that we are seeing affecting and operating within the philanthropic landscape in the region. So specifically, we looked into the landscape of institutional giving, and one of the things which came out, and I just want to mention at this point that this was taken through in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. We wanted to look at what are some of the registration frameworks that we are able to see being taken by the institutions that we are talking about. And we found out that in Kenya, for example, majority of these vehicles of giving are registered as NGOs. But we look at the Rwandan case, majority of them are registered as societies. Tanzania and Uganda, still majority are registered as NGOs. And we'll be able to share this presentation, or rather these preliminary findings with you under the handout section. We looked into cross-border philanthropy and found out that Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania was having a lot of cross-border giving taking place, with 3.8% of the organizations that we interviewed showing that they are involved in cross-border philanthropy. Tanzania and Uganda had very little to do with cross-border philanthropy, with only 0.9% of the respondents indicating that they are involved in that. What motivates giving across the region was majorly the need to bring a social change, the need to support the less fortunate. Some of the organizations were driven by impact, some were driven by Pan-Africanism, social justice, amongst many other issues that affected giving. What I wanted to talk about majorly is how this looks like in terms of the achievements and alignments to SDGs. And the delegates of this conference today, one of the things that has come out in our many previous researches indicated that education was the most funded pillar within the SDGs, quality education, for a very long time. But over the last 2 years, 3 years, what this research is telling us that majority of the funding towards the SDG goals is actually going towards decent work and economic growth. And there's a lot of resources going into, gender equality, quality education, followed very closely by good health and well-being. But we are also seeing climate action taking chunk of that funding that we are talking about across the region. I want to talk briefly around the emerging practices within institutional philanthropy that we were able to see. And 48% of the respondents indicated that they give less than 50% of their annual income towards philanthropic causes. And out of those 48%, within those who are registered as NGOs, 50% of them gave less than 50,000. Those registered as CBOs, 78% of them gave less than $50,000 towards the causes that we want to, understand and discuss today. And out of those which are registered as societies, 43% of them gave less than $250,000. Same as 85% of those registered as companies limited by guarantee, giving less than $250,000 towards philanthropic causes. The preferred giving approaches that we saw in this research, majority, actually 35%, preferred giving in terms of grants. But there's also giving in terms of in-kind giving, which was coming second at 31%, all the way to community giving, which stands at 23%. And there's also online giving and sponsorship, or in terms of events that giving practices were also taking shape through. There are many challenges which came out of this research in terms of the giving practices that we are seeing. And one of them is really forming part of the conversations that we are going to have in the next 3 days. And one of them is, people are working in silos. There's limited information. There's poor and unreliable flow of funding within these institutions that are giving towards the causes that we are talking about. But also one thing came out strongly, that there's poor or rather inadequate awareness in terms of existing resources. And that is why platforms like where we are today, the conferences that we are talking about, the learning platforms that really enable us to share what are the opportunities, the challenges, and how do we reposition as a sector? And to bring it close to the conference theme, how do we re-engineer as a sector to meet the growing demands that we are seeing? There are a lot of factors which came out in this research that is affecting the capital flow, the demands that are coming from the communities that are being supported and the organizations that are supporting these communities. And one of them is that people are moving towards long-term investments, and people are expanding their perspectives from just giving to giving with impact. And they are looking at how do they have systems that support the long-term change and not just the immediate needs that communities are having. And so there's also another thing that we saw, that there's a lot of potential of individual giving. If you look at the other slide that I talked about, there's a lot of giving that is coming from individuals. And of course, looking at the last 2 years, technology is playing a very critical role in the giving that is taking place in the region. I don't want to talk much about accountability. We saw from the respondents that most of them are accountable to the target constituents. There are those who are looking at accountability accountability towards the donors more than anything else. Of course, the government was a factor around the accountability issues that we are talking about. In terms of the partnerships and collaborations, which for us as an institution is very critical in terms of shaping the impact that the sector can see and can experience in terms of bringing a change, and the partnerships and collaborations agenda, we saw that majority of the organizations that we interviewed preferred strategic partnerships, partnerships that would position them to open more opportunities. We saw another group preferring to have funding alliances. So they wanted to see how do we collaborate in a more strategic manner to bring a change within the communities that they are serving. Of course, cost sharing was another determinant and factor that was guiding collaborations, grant matching, joint ventures, amongst other areas that was guiding this. I want to talk briefly as I come to a close, the future of partnerships for philanthropy growth. NGOs, or rather the not-for-profit organizations, were the ones which were most interested in forging partnerships for impact. And that was followed very closely, and this is not shocking, by the private sector and the government as one of the key institutions that was really interested in crafting partnerships, partnerships with the philanthropic space. Of course, community-based organizations were equally interested, and you can see the margins are not that much. And this shows you how important collaboration within the space that we are serving is. As I come to a close, one of the most effective ways in which people want to see more impact and to engage, enlarge their audience on key issues that they're attending to is this collaboration agenda. And so we as a sector must really invest in partnerships and collaborations to enable us achieve more impact in the work that we are doing. And this is again driven by the fact that as a sector, as philanthropy, that our nimbleness, that our ability to be very unique, to engage in innovative strategies, innovative ideas that really enable us to have, promote partnerships, one with the government, with the private sector, and any other organization that is being used as a vehicle for development. We need to really engage in such. The impact of philanthropy, institutional philanthropy in specific, I think that is very obvious. We want to see more of this sector being appreciated. We want to see more partnerships being built to enable social impact. We want to see more access towards service provision being given to the communities. And so the more need for us to be more impactful, as institutions. The research pointed out that majority of the respondents wanted more learning platforms. They wanted to see the sector influencing policies more, policies which are geared towards shaping giving practices. They wanted to see more of such. Collaboration and partnership came third, with most organizations being in need of initiatives that enable them to build alliances with like-minded individuals. Of course, the issue of knowledge also came into play. They want vehicles like EAPN, vehicles like the Africa Philanthropy Network, vehicles like the National Philanthropy Forums in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, to really engage more in terms of research and data collection. And this is a call for duty, for us as a sector to really have platforms, strengthen platforms, create platforms that enable learning, that enable us to influence the operating environment, that enables us to, as a sector, come together and engage in conversations and initiatives that, strengthen us. Irungu, I know I've said I'm coming to a close many times, and I really want to now come to a close. This is my last in the presentation. I cannot finish before talking about communities. And what came out is that for us to position communities in a manner that enables them to, one, be more impactful, two, engage with other like-minded entities in positioning them for impact, we need to build their capacity. We need to build their capacity to be able to mobilize resources. We need to nurture or rather nurture leadership between and amongst them so that they can meet the social demands of the people at the grassroots level. More partnerships need to be done, partnerships that really bring change. And I think we've talked much about that. And so at this moment in time, Irungu and all the delegates of the conference, I really want to challenge us to look at where the sector is headed to within the region and how we can reposition ourselves, how we can make use of the existing opportunities, even as we deal with the challenges that exist within the space to enable us achieve impact. And I want to believe that the next few days will launch us into a space where we'll have these conversations, amongst others, to enable us get out of this conference with very practical, actionable areas of operation that will enable us grow as a sector. Thank you so much, and back to you, Irungu.
Thank you very much, Evans, and thank you also for your thought leadership in the movement more broadly. I'll invite the communications team, your communications team, to just share some of those slides on the Twitter and Facebook, as we weren't able to follow a number of the slides as you presented, but the presentation was extremely clear. I think what I picked is one or two things. One is collaboration is critical. It is difficult to collaborate in a context in which we are continually pressed to display our logos and our brands, and we invest a lot of time in institutional egos, if I can use that word. But what we're learning now is actually power comes from solidarity, from partnerships. And I think three things occurred to me. One was a presentation by Taka Awori at the beginning of the year, where she talked about VUCA and the importance of agility. And I think that was on an East Africa Philanthropy Association platform. The second one, of course, is the global debate about new power, and that power is not what comes from within, it comes from what is with others. And lastly, of course, the shift the power narrative that has been generated by many of us to really bring philanthropy back to where it belongs, which is a community, mass-based people solidarity that is challenging all forms of concentration of capital and power. So thank you very much, Evans. I'm going to take us very quickly to Jacqueline Asimue, who is the board chair of EAPN. She is she's an advocate and a social development thought leader. She is the founder of Source Africa Philanthropy Advisory Firm that provides advice to agencies that are interested in furthering philanthropic practice in Africa. She's also a certified professional coach and active in the Ugandan context. And one thing that I did know about her that has now been publicly revealed is that she likes to read. I suspected that would be probably logical, but the more interesting one is she likes to dance. Welcome, Jacqueline Caribou.
I just want to ask, can you hear me?
Yep, you're coming in loud and clear.
Okay, and can you see me? That I'm not sure about.
Oh, let's see. It looks like you are, yep, you're slightly off to the right of our screens. Yep, you're good. It's a little bit grainy. I think that was probably the internet, yes, but we can see you.
Okay then. Thank you. So should I face this way? Should I?
Well, if you turn to your right slightly and look down, probably at the back of Evan's head, and then you've got eye contact with us. I won't ask you to dance. Exactly.
I just might try. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. Now being told to look this way. So anyhow, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever on the globe you're joining us. Welcome on behalf of the board to the 7th East Africa Philanthropy Conference. We say a very big thank you to our sponsors who have given us the resources to help us put this conference together. We also say a hearty thank you to our partners, our members, and the committee that was responsible for helping the Secretariat think this through. We also, last but not by no means least, say a very big thank you to Evans Okinyi, the CEO of EAPN, and his team at the Secretariat. They have literally spent sleepless nights for us to be able to be here today and for the next 3 days. So if you can, on your devices, just send them a smiley, a love heart, anything you can to show appreciation to them. This conference happens on the backdrop of unprecedented disruption and shifts. Last year, when the COVID-19 pandemic was rearing its ugly head, states decided to close their borders, decided to close their airports, and mobility was highly restricted. Did philanthropists come in to support what was going on? Yes, indeed they did. But we also know that some had to be evacuated back to their home countries. And so, as always happens every day across this continent, communities looked to each other to support each other. As CivSource Africa, we documented hundreds upon hundreds of stories of communities helping each other in the deepest and darkest moments of COVID-19 and the lockdowns that happened. I remember a story of a young boy of about 10 to 11 who sold his rabbits. He was rearing rabbits, and he sold some of them and took the money that he got to the district COVID relief center. I also remember the story of some young men that came together and were fetching water for the elders in their community. I'm also reminded of another story of a nurse who wheeled a patient in a wheelbarrow for 7 kilometers to the nearest health center so that the patient could access health care. And that's just 3 of the many stories. And I'm sure all of us with the countries that we represent can tell stories upon stories where communities came together. Now, the unfortunate thing is that today, those kinds of people are not here with us on the table. And as we think about re-engineering philanthropy, which is the theme of our conference, we must begin to think about who is on the table, who is seen, who is present, and who is heard. We often like to think of our ecosystem as inclusive. Indeed, we do talk about inclusivity. But I would like to invite us, as we think about re-engineering philanthropy, part of that will be to rethink who is at the table and how we enable our table to be as expansive as there are givers and efforts to promote communities of dignity. The conference is also happening against a backdrop of vaccine discrimination. And if you remember, just about 25 years ago, we were faced with this very same question around vaccines for HIV/AIDS, when a lot of Africans, a lot of poor Africans that were dying from HIV/AIDS could not access the early treatments for HIV/AIDS. And fast forward to today, we're literally where we started, and we're dealing with a vaccine apartheid. And so what is the role of philanthropy as we think of re-engineering in a space that is still highly discriminatory, highly unequal, and where there are also other ravages that are taking place, climate change, continued shrinking space. So these are the things that we need to contend with. In fact, I invite us to think about creating a totally new table. And it has happened before. I think about the electric car. A few years ago, that seemed totally like a pipe dream. But fast forward to today, all of us are starting to wonder when it will actually come to our economies, because it is the solution of now. If you think a few years ago when mobile money technology was just beginning and how the banks literally fought it. And I'm sure, fast forward to today, many of those bank officials who fought mobile money access are themselves beneficiaries of mobile money technologies. And so building a new table is possible. Re-engineering philanthropy is possible. As one of my favorite professors says, Professor Sylvia Tamale, in speaking about affirmative action in relation to women in politics and decision making, it's not an issue of add and stir, because that's what we did. We did not change the frame, We merely added women and stirred and hoped that somehow we would create, countries and communities that were equal. We would create laws that promoted equality, and that didn't quite happen. And so we also have bad examples to learn from and to teach us that re-engineering is not about tinkering at the edges. Re-engineering is about upturning tables. And it means we need to be bold, we need to be unconventional, and dare I say, we need to be rebellious. That is what it takes to build a new way. It's no longer about sloganeering. Re-engineering is not sloganeering. And so we invite you in the next 3 days as we think together in the plenaries, as we listen to the keynote addresses, as we converse together in the breakaway sessions, that we will be fully committed to this work. Part of this work, of course, will create anxieties and fears. Part of this work will mean some of us have to die in order that new life might emerge. But let's be brave. We are doing this together. We cannot do it alone. We're doing it as a community. And so I invite us and I welcome us. Welcome once again. Back to you, Irungu.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for those inspiring words. And I'm told that we are running very close to the deadline. So I'm going to, with no further ado or delay, just invite a keynote address from Peter Lohan, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Conrad Hilton Foundation. And Peter Lohan is the President and Chief Executive. He is a passionate leader with 25 years of foundation building and non-profit experience. He has largely focused on the well-being of vulnerable children and children's rights. And previously to that, he was the Executive Director of the Firelight Foundation that supported a number of organizations worldwide on areas of education, resilience, and health, particularly for vulnerable children and their families. I'm going to invite the technicians to just bring Peter in, and it's going to be a recorded broadcast. So I hope we're able to do that without any difficulty. Here we go. That looks like Peter. Caribou, Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter Lohan, and I'm President and CEO of the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. It's an honor to connect with all of you today as we reflect on the events of the last year and a half, identifying how philanthropy rooted in the communities it serves has an advantage over larger, distant funders, and is uniquely positioned to contribute toward recovery efforts. It is exciting to see this conference designed to support such a diverse range of partners across philanthropy, as our shared goals will inform the steps we each take within the coming months and years. At the Hilton Foundation, we believe that the most effective solutions to problems come from the very people living in impacted communities. It is the local leaders and local organizations who know what is best for their own communities. This is also true of local philanthropy. Funders will never be able to do the work that the people can do in the community. We must rather invest in the leaders within communities themselves. We've seen this kind of success through the work of Kennedy Odede and Shafko and Kibera, who many of you no doubt know. Kennedy brings a deep knowledge and understanding of informal settlements, a knowledge that we funders simply do not have. This is true in all communities. Likewise, local philanthropy, as opposed to offshore funders like the Hilton Foundation, has a deep understanding of the nuanced issues facing their communities. This insider knowledge is critical to inform giving, ensuring that the funding goes to those who need it most and comes in the form that is the most useful. This often includes the building of the capacity of local grassroots organizations, which local foundations are well positioned to identify, improving an area's resiliency over the long term. So whether addressing a sudden crisis or a long-standing issue, local partnerships are critical to a successful response. Local foundations, because of their role at the center of community giving, have experience working closely with local agencies and can leverage their existing relationships to ensure resources move swiftly to those closest to the issue. These organizations stay long after well-intentioned international donors have left, positioning themselves as trusted leaders within communities. Lessons learned from one situation can then be used by local funders to inform future work in other situations. We've seen this in the success that the East African Philanthropy Network has had in its efforts to address inequality. For example, increasing philanthropy support to the disability community in Uganda and Tanzania in an effort to attract non-traditional funders as well as business to invest in the disability sector. EAPN's work to strengthen the policy and legislative framework in Uganda and Tanzania by reviving the national philanthropy forums will also be a voice of influence and advocacy for an enabling environment for the philanthropy sector and for the broader civic space. Likewise, the SDG Philanthropy Platform is another great example of a successful multi-stakeholder partnership where philanthropy, including local philanthropy, ignited a movement to help communities work towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the end of the day, when funding decisions are made locally, they best reflect the needs of the people we serve. And yet, oftentimes local philanthropy is not included at these important conversations, and larger organizations have been unable or unwilling to support localization efforts, which would ensure that communities are driving system change efforts locally. But when we leave local community members out of the discussions, the solutions aren't as effective. Thus, we believe that for communities to thrive, there needs to be a shift toward greater local decision-making. This means that communities should receive more funding directly from donors. Community members should be deeply engaged in program design, strategy, and funding decisions, and community members should be seen, should be heard in their own voices, and should have presence and power at the table where decisions are made. For those who serve communities around the world, we need to improve on the ways we represent people through images, stories, and narrative, mainly by making space for them to tell their own stories in ways that are meaningful to them. Solving the challenges facing communities today calls for collaboration, for multi-stakeholder partnerships, and for everyone playing their unique part. And philanthropy has a critical role to play as convener and facilitator. Now, there are three paradigm shifts that we at Hilton are looking to make. First, global bodies need to change the way they support local work. We need to look at what changes are really needed by global actors to meet demands at the local level. This includes looking at ways to build and create pathways toward more independent lives and livelihoods for people and communities. Second, agility is paramount. Organizations need to be much more agile in their approach to both understanding local needs and to responding to them. Part of this work means identifying what systems and processes need to change. The third paradigm shift is that we need to align incentives with local needs. This means looking at how decision-making is distributed and how organizations are incentivized. National legal frameworks, funding from national and local level, and international aid structures can all be barriers. Moving forward, organizations must share risk in a different way to allow for more resilient and independent livelihoods for individuals and communities. So it's time to partner deeply with communities and to center their ideas in building solutions. We must also work much more collaboratively between philanthropy, civil society, the private sector, governments, and advocates. When we expand our view of who does what, with a focus on the value community members can bring to solutions, we can solve problems more effectively. When we listen closely to those in impacted communities, build solutions with them and not for them, and partner with much greater intention, we'll see a bright future for all of us. Thank you very much and have a wonderful conference.
Great, and thank you very much, Peter, for those words. And I think if I take the three interventions that we've just had from Evans, Jacqueline, and Peter, what stands out for me really is kind of four things. One is the importance of data and information, but evidence-based programming is critical, particularly when we start to think in terms of scale. So we are increasingly more ambitious than the small micro projects that we run. We are looking at how do we transform societies, regions, and of course, the world. The second area really, I think, was made very clear earlier around how do we shift narratives and communication. And this is extremely important as we begin to think about coming up against many of the much of the disinformation, the digital incitement that we're seeing across communities and across nations as well. Thirdly, I think we would do well to recall the advice really to think about agility, and agility not just of decision making, but also resources and ability to pivot and to leverage different resources that are available to us that we have not yet used, primarily because we've been stuck in an international aid paradigm. And then lastly, I think perhaps we can pick this up as the mantra for the conference really is the issue of risk-taking. Can we be bold? Can we be audacious? Because that's the only way that we will remain resilient and relevant and able to shape an enabling environment in the course of these two twin, waves that are hitting us at the moment. And that is the wave of COVID-19 and the wave of the recession. So I'm going to turn, if I can, once again, we are live. Many of us are joining us from all over the world, but particularly within the East African region. If you've joined us since we began in the morning, please leave your name, the organization you serve, and also an expectation that you have for the conference. And the conference organizers continue to review this to make sure that we can see how to shift this around. We're about to change tack and move into the first plenary of the morning, or the second plenary of the morning, I guess. And the title of this theme is Sailing the Disruptive Wave, Establishing Meanings for Philanthropy in Emerging Realities. I'm going to invite very warmly Matt Reeves of the Aga Khan Foundation to moderate this session and to introduce his guests for the plenary we're about to go through. Matt, karibu sana.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, evening to friends who are joining us from elsewhere in the world. Great. So as Irungu said, our session, our panel session this morning is going to be Sailing the Disruptive Wave, Establishing Meaning for Philanthropy in Emerging Realities. We're going to dig into some of these issues and questions that have already come up in some of the speeches and intros this morning, particularly around the challenges and trends that we're seeing in African and global philanthropy, but also digging into what it means to be bold and, as Irungu said, audacious in response to some of those challenges and trends. In terms of the process for this panel, I'm going to begin by introducing the three panelists who have graciously joined us this morning, and then we have a few questions for them. After that, we hopefully should still have some time for questions from the delegates. And so if you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panelists, please do so using the Q&A tab in the conference platform. And then in the last few minutes, we'll go back briefly to the panelists for their reflections. And so with that, and with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist this morning, who will be familiar to many of you, Professor Bekinkosi Moyo, who is the director of an adjunct professor at the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, CAPSI. Becky is a writer, researcher, and thought leader who's championed the African discourse on philanthropy, contributed to the growth of many African civil society formations, and taken part in the continental process of development and governance. He served as programs director for the Pan-African organization Trust Africa and supported the formation of the African Union Foundation. So welcome, Becky. Would you like to come on screen and briefly introduce yourself and your work at CAPSI?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. As introduced, I'm Begi Moyo. I am currently with the Wits Business School in Johannesburg, South Africa. I also direct the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. We set up this center essentially to bridge the gap between theory and practice. Some of you would know that for the most memorable time in Africa, we did not have much written on African philanthropy by Africans. And so we wanted to make sure that we develop a cohort of experts and researchers on African philanthropy and social investment. So that's the first We are doing that by producing postgraduates in the area of philanthropy, PhDs, masters, and of late we have introduced short courses and a diploma in philanthropy. The second issue that the center does is to try and change the narrative on African philanthropy. Again, for many, many years, the African philanthropy landscape and its positioning in universality was that we were further down the ladder, so to speak. And our role as the center is to try and afford each form of philanthropy its own position universally. And by positioning the stories of African giving, African forms of private sector engagement, as well as what happens in the third sector generally. And finally, we are interested in making sure that practice and theory go hand in hand. And so we do lots of interventions that bring the community and academics together. So that's what the center does. And thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us this morning, Becky. I'd like to start with the first question to you before we move to the other panelists. And that is, with these changes that we're hearing about happening globally, what do you see as some of the emerging nuances that African philanthropy will need to contend with and act upon?
Thank you so much. I think for me, African philanthropy will have to continue to contend with existing challenges that are facing the continent, but obviously being aware of what's happening globally. And so one of the first things that I think we definitely have to contend with, and this is as a result of the current moment, African philanthropy will have to contend with the impacts and the effects of COVID-19. And here I'm talking about the sudden shifts that have occurred as a result of COVID-19 on systems. And I think that for many of us, we were caught very much unprepared to pivot to new ways of working, to new models, to new styles of leadership, among others, but essentially to a new way of living and working. And I think that lots of what philanthropy needs to do is to contend with those shifts, invest in them so that the systems change does not lead us into a disaster. When the systems change, there's obviously a possibility of success, but there's also a possibility of disaster. And I'm on the point that philanthropy will have to invest so that these systems change lead to success. I think the second is the shift in donor trends. As a result of COVID-19, we have seen some donors becoming very, very conservative, while others opted to be progressive. Of course, we want to align ourselves with the progressive ones, but how do we work with those that became conservative to make them understand that the problems that existed before COVID will still be around even after COVID has gone? And then the third issue around contending with COVID and its impact is building forward from the ashes of COVID-19. I mean, a lot of countries are feeling very much devastated. I mean, some countries are going into third, fourth waves, anticipating that even towards the end of the year, we will still be living with COVID. How do we get ourselves out of that? I think that's what African philanthropy needs to contend with. And African philanthropy has these issues. One is that of solidarity. Whenever there is a challenge in a community, communities mobilize resources and build backwards. And so I think that's something that we should be able to utilize. What are the values? What are the different resources that are found in African philanthropy, and use that to build from the ashes of COVID-19. The second big issue to contend with when you're looking at the global shifts and changes is the inequality that has grown across the continent and globally. Of course, before COVID, inequality levels were already high, but COVID has made it even worse. It has exacerbated the situation. I'm talking here about income inequality, wealth inequality, gender inequality, education, property rights, etc., and etc. I mean, I don't know if you know this. Oxfam, a couple of years back, reported that there are 3 Africans whose wealth is equivalent to half the population of the entire continent. I mean, that already tells us a lot about the levels of inequality and how, if some of our high net worth rich individuals wanted to solve some of these issues, they could simply do so. So there's something to say about systems change. There's something to say about those that have the resources being in a position to solve these problems, but they are not doing so. So African philanthropy will have to work with those that have the resources, mobilize them, but also conscientize them to actually take care of some of these inequalities that exist among us. I think the third issue will be the climate change and biodiversity. I just did an article on the Alliance magazine looking at this issue. The impact of climate change is very much likely to be worse than the impact of COVID-19. We already see some of that in some of the regions in Africa, with floods, with cyclones, with droughts, with heat waves, leading to massive destruction. And so my view is that if philanthropy does not invest in mitigating and adapting to climate change, we are going to have a big problem. And it will be very difficult for us to even deal with the climate change problem than we have dealt with COVID-19. With COVID-19, we could easily, go into research, come up with vaccines and mobilize people to be vaccinated. With climate change, it's a different type of game. And I think that we need to begin investing heavily on this. Finally, I think there's need for us to think about the youth dividend. By 2025, 2030, the majority of the people in this continent are just going to be young people. We need economies that are structured and geared towards, building a future for people who are young, for people who are going to be occupying this planet. So I think this speaks really to issues of the continued challenges around exclusion, racism, patriarchy, and all other forms of discrimination that the world faces. And I think that if philanthropy were to pay attention to that, the global shifts and the global changes will just be some of the waves that we are riding. But the essential challenges will still remain, and we need to pay more attention to that.
Thanks, Becky. And we'll be coming back to you for some of your thoughts on bold and audacious responses to some of these challenges a bit later on. But first, I'd like to introduce our second panelist. So Sasha Fisher moved to East Africa in July 2010 to develop the Spark microgrants model. Her experiences in South Sudan, South Africa, India, and Uganda have led to her passion for community-led development. She holds a BA from the University of Vermont in studio art and a self-designed major in human security, a paradigm for development that recognizes the legitimacy of non-state actors in securing basic human needs. And so welcome, Sasha. Thanks for joining us. We'd love to open the floor to you to talk a little bit about your work with Spark microgrants to begin with.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to the East Africa Philanthropy Network for organizing this. I'm already fired up by Jackie, what you were saying earlier as the conference was opening, and Becky, what you were just saying. What an incredible space to have to talk about the future of philanthropy in the region. And I'm looking forward to that influencing the rest of the world and how philanthropy works. So thank you all for organizing this. I, of course, am not from East Africa. I grew up in the U.S. And so when I came to this work, it was in reaction, to be quite honest, to how prescriptive and top-down and messy Western philanthropy is and how much we've really messed it up. A lot of foreign support kind of comes in and imposes solutions on communities and forces them to sit on the sidelines of the very change meant to uplift them, which makes no sense at all. And so we wanted to see, can we change that paradigm and actually get resources directly into the hands of communities, women and men, young and old, within villages across East Africa, so that they can make decisions themselves over how that capital is spent to put towards their vision and their dreams for their own village. And so today we actually have a proactive grant-making process where we reach out to villages in partnership with civil society and governments and give basically help facilitate a village planning process of about 6 months, paired with a seed grant of 8,000 USD. Every village, every time, because every village has a great idea and every village should get money. And it's been a lot of fun to see just how, I think at the beginning, it was people would always say, oh, it's so risky, let people, have decision-making power. It's like the least risky thing in the world to do is let community members have the power over their own future. It is the smartest thing to do and the easiest also as well. So I've been very grateful to be able to be engaged myself in that work, and hopefully we can shift the ways of Western philanthropy as well to support the region in a more appropriate ways and less prescriptive and colonial ways.
Thanks, Sasha. Welcome. Building upon that, my first question to you is, what do you see as some of the evolving trends in building local ownership that private philanthropy should be aware of and be part of?
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Well, I think the region is already really good, and what we've already heard throughout the introductions to today is that community philanthropy is alive and well on the continent. This is one of the powerful things that exists, right? Community members support community members. If somebody goes to the capital city, they still send resources back. I mean, there's an immense amount of community philanthropy already happening. In more formalized philanthropy, or like, I don't want to say formalized, maybe more institutionalized philanthropy, I think there's been this, I'm going to kind of take a few mega steps back and start with how we've seen it evolve over time and where we hope it will go in the future to be a little bit more equitable and open to all the people it should benefit. When, at the foundational start of philanthropy was like very prescriptive and top down, what we call prescriptive philanthropy, where a foundation or a donor goes in and says, we want to give you a water well and you're going to thank us for it and applaud us. And that's kind of like a little bit of the colonialism vibe reincarnated in that. And then this whole question of like, how do you get it to be more local over time? I think that is what's happening, is that there's this push to then go to what's popular today, what's called participatory philanthropy, where community members get to have input into the programs that are meant to benefit them. And we still think that whole paradigm is actually like, not sufficient, because you're trying to like push it closer to people instead of starting with the people and allowing it to grow from people. And so we think that there's a third wave, and that the third wave pushes even further. It's not top down, right? Out, people kind of coming in and imposing solutions. It's not participatory, where community members have some say in the decision-making process, but it's community-driven, where community members, women and men, young and old, have the fundamental decision-making power over what development looks like in their village, that resources flow directly to them, and there's a semi-equitable decision-making process over how those resources will be used. And that community-driven future is one that I see immense opportunity for, that the region will both kind of catapult and also teach the rest of the world, because the rest of the world needs that just as much. We see a dearth of community in a lot of parts of the world. That's the economic and democratic kind of crises at the moment. And that community-driven model, I think, will be critical. I'm going to add one more thing to it, which is that sometimes the community-driven and local get confused, and a lot of groups will support a local leader in what can be a tokenistic way. And community-driven isn't just local. It's not just one local person representing a larger area. It means that there's representation from all the different types of folks in one village, and that people have to collaborate to figure out what's a shared vision for their village together, so we don't reenact what are the global dynamics that Becky was just talking about, of massive inequality where there's a few elites that are making decisions and then the masses are left out. That trickles down, and we see that at every kind of sub-level, from the global level right down to the village level, where if you don't protect space for inclusive participation, you get elite domination and a few people benefiting from stuff at the village level and holding their power. So we want to make sure that that's open so that women and youth can participate freely and be part of that conversation and driving force. Thanks so much, Sasha. Really interesting, and we should be returning to you also to build upon that a little bit later on. Our third panelist is Jacqueline Asimue. I'm not going to read necessarily her entire bio again, because Irungu read it so well earlier. But to paraphrase,
She's the founder of CivSource Africa. She is the chairperson of the board of the East Africa Philanthropy Network. She loves to tell stories, and she also loves to read and dance. Jackie, welcome. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about the work of CivSource?
Thank you, Matt, and good morning to all our guests once again. And thank you for the two panelists that have gone before me. Very interesting and powerful points. So we describe ourselves at CivSource as a philanthropy support organization. And we also see ourselves as a critical player in building the field, both in Uganda and across the continent, of philanthropy. And we say that we do this through 5 C's. The first one is that we collect the data about philanthropy and as it happens in Uganda where we are located. As Becky said in his comments, that there is a dearth of research about philanthropy, and that is very true here in Uganda. And so we want to collect data about how Ugandans give, what they give, what motivates our giving, how to grow it, and all those things. So collecting. The other is that we are in the business of curating stories of giving and generosity from across our country. And we started down that path last year during the first lockdown, where we did 4 volumes of stories about generosity during the time of COVID-19. And we've continued that this year. And like I shared in my opening remarks, just very beautiful, amazing, powerful stories. So we love to tell the stories. We've also curated proverbs, African proverbs on giving and generosity. We are soon going to hold an exhibition of expressions and symbols of generosity in Uganda. And so we want to, it's just that connecting people to how homegrown philanthropy is done. We also do this through catalyzing the next generation, next gen giving, as we call it. And this is really, we have a proverb in one of our local languages that you bend a tree when it is still young. And so in a sense, if we want to inculcate giving, we start as early as we can. So we're thinking of programs right from nursery school, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. How do you get them interested and invested in giving so that you grow a generation of givers? We're also interested in consulting, because we know that there are high net worth individuals or organizations that want to give better, give more impactfully. So it's just thinking alongside them as they create their visions for giving. And the last is connecting, part of what we are doing today. That's why we're members of EAPN, of the Africa Philanthropy Network, of WINGS, and many others, because we know that we can't do this work alone. We know that we learn in spaces when we are together. So we love to connect, from the Philanthropy Forum in Uganda to the gathering of givers that we host, to all these other points across the continent, that we can connect and, like I said, build the field. So that's what we're about, Matt.
Thanks, Jackie. It's wonderful to have you on this panel this morning. Our questions to you are going to be sort of following up in the storytelling vein. And to start off, we wanted to ask, what strategies do we need to put in place to ensure that the African narrative gets and is getting heard, both by Africa's people, but also by the rest of the world?
I think the short answer is that there are as many strategies as there are givers. And I think that is the first thing to recognize, that each giver connects with storytelling in a different way. And therefore, my utopia is, can we provide a platform for anybody that wants to tell, whether it's their story or their neighbor's story? How can we connect them to platforms where they can tell their stories in their own way? We know that technology has aided us a lot, and that stories are getting out faster, and in a sense, the story making space is equitable. In a sense, I say. And the sense is, the reverse of that challenge is that we haven't yet hacked a way to tell stories in the multiplicity of languages that there are across this continent. And so unfortunately, we find that we have to funnel them through English, French, Portuguese. Swahili maybe is the only language that's ours, but all the others are languages that are not indigenous to us. And so how do we, even as Africans, think of ways of telling stories through our language and making our language part of what is globally heard, not just accepted, but heard, right? And I think it will be interesting to be part of that space. But if we talk about current ways of doing it, like I said, it's. I have this image of how we tell our stories, either by the fireplace or under the big tree in the village where we all congregate and we're all equalized. You each bring your chair or mat and just sit around and speak to each other and show each other and talk to each other. I think there will also be benefit in cross-fertilization. So, and that's why partly we're doing the exhibition, so that if I'm in Karamoja in eastern Uganda, I'll get to understand how people in Kisoro in southwestern Uganda give, so that I'm also opening my eyes to how other communities in my country give, but also opening eyes to how other communities across this continent give. So I think it's really harnessing the benefit of technology, enabling each giver to tell a story in the platform that is most accessible to them, but also enabling the world to hear us through our language.
Thanks so much, Jackie. So we're going to go back and do another round of questions with each of the panelists, and then after that we're going to open up the floor to questions. I see a couple coming in on the Q&A, but if you have questions for the panelists, please don't hesitate to drop them into that Q&A tab. So coming back to Becky, so building resilience for the future is going to mean taking risks and being audacious, being bold. What are some of the risks that philanthropy will have to weigh to support human resilience and to mitigate against some of these challenges and trends that you identified previously?
Thank you again, Matt. So for me, I think, one of the first things that I think we need to do is probably just use the, what we call going back to basics. Let's just go back to basics and understand what is the nature and the role of philanthropy. What is its meaning? And to me, every person has a story, as Jackie has just said. It really depends on your experiences and the communities that you relate with and how you solve issues at the local level. So going to basics means building a foundation around how we deal with issues of our relations with nature, for example. How do we live harmoniously with nature? I think one of the things that COVID-19 has really made us do is to go back to basics and just understand the importance of nature, the importance of just knowing our surroundings and understanding that each and every feature around us means something to us, and it affects the way in which we live and the way in which we can even succeed or fail. So that's one of the first things for me, that, what is the foundation right for us to even talk about avoiding or responding to issues of resilience. The second is really to talk about how do we build relations. And I think for me, this is something that has been missing in this space. How does philanthropy build relations with the private sector, the public sector, and of course with the non-profit sector? I think there's been a lot of relations built, probably not in an equal way or equitable manner between the non-profit sector and philanthropies. But there hasn't been much of the three-way relationship, what I would call a triangle of success. How do we build that? And I think philanthropy will have to be bold enough to understand that the problems that we face today and in future will require all three sectors to work together. And that means at times having to let go of our identities, let go of our egos, just to find solutions for the problems that we face. Countries that succeeded in dealing with the pandemic countries that understood the relationship between the state and its function, the role of civil society, as well as the role of philanthropy in the private sector. Countries that wanted to, operate like the military or from a command perspective, like we saw in some parts in Southern Africa where government wanted to do everything, they did not do well in terms of responding to COVID-19. There's a role for everyone, and I think Sasha was talking about the role for communities and where solutions lie. We have seen it during this period that communities are always the first to respond to a crisis, to a pandemic. They've got the resources. We normally come into communities and displace those solutions by our own solutions, and the result is disaster. So how does philanthropy realize that solutions are found where they think there's a problem? So where they think there's a rot, there's a solution. How do we turn the challenges into solutions? And I think that's where philanthropy needs to invest in. And I think working with government, working with the private sector, we stand a better chance of solving the current and forthcoming challenges than we did in the past. And I think we can talk about how this can happen. We've got examples that are already happening in different countries through the SDGs platforms and others. I think the third thing rather, is that I think philanthropy would have to fund and invest a lot on civil society, social movements, and local grassroots organizations than it has done in the past. And it has to do so in an equitable manner, understanding the local realities, the sensibilities, and the sensitivities that exist at the local level, funding communities at what they are good at, and not trying to change them and professionalize them into lookalike donor systems, donor models, among others. So I think that would be very important for philanthropy to insist that if you are supporting community-based organizations, civil society, support their strengths, support their capacities. Don't turn them into what you are. They are not what you are. And so I think that would be very, very important, because what we see today is that the majority of foundations, high net worth individuals, are interested in funding governments. The latest two reports by the Bridgespan and the Africa Philanthropy Forum research actually shows that the biggest grants that have ever been made by high net worth individuals in Africa have been given to the public sector, to government. And very few of those grants have gone to civil society. And the latest report shows that over a period of 10 years, the high net worth individuals in Africa have never given at the level that they gave between March last year and December last year. So between March and December last year, the high net worth individuals gave more than $265 million US. And this is more than what they've ever given in a 10-year period. That says that they are interested, or they lean towards material oriented grants or disaster management or disaster or humanitarian activities. That is fine, but the challenges of this continent are far much worse and far much complex than material things and humanitarian assistance. They are more of systems, they are more of complexity, and that requires some of our African philanthropists to fund in systems change, policies, but also issues around social justice and building a better world that we all want to see. And so that requires a change in behavior, a change in trends, but also a change in thinking around some of our African philanthropists. Finally, I think for me, it is investing in local solutions. And this is for both local and international philanthropy, because I think it's good to talk about African philanthropy, but African philanthropy does not exist in a vacuum. It is impacted and affected by other forms of philanthropy in Africa, but also internationally. And so what are these local solutions? For me, I see investing in local capacities and local capabilities. And this requires a different way of thinking. How do you invest in local capabilities beyond what we normally do? Come in and say, we train you in financial management, for example. We do a workshop in capacity development. without taking into account the environment and the overall systems overview of what capabilities look like. So how do we build local capabilities? The second is research, data, knowledge. These are very, very important. I think as Jackie was saying, we can never tell our story if we don't have the knowledge and the data. And so we need to invest in that. And more often people think that, this is just academic and all of that. It's not. The reason why African philanthropy has been relegated to the bottom of the pyramid is simply because our stories have not been told boldly and widely enough to be positioned at the same level as other forms of philanthropies. I think local infrastructure is important. I think Jackie and Tim have also spoken a bit to that, and I think some of the following sessions will talk to that. But we need to strengthen the infrastructure for philanthropy in the continent. Whether we are talking about research institutions, we're talking about grant-making institutions, we're talking about peer-to-peer institutions, all these need to be supported and they need to be strengthened. Human resources are very, very important. We know what's happening currently. A lot of us end up being poached and we end up working for international organizations in Africa. That on its own is an indictment on African philanthropy. We need to strengthen local capacities, human resource, but make sure that as we globalize our practice, we don't weaken that which is happening at the foundation and the local level. And finally, we need to enhance and invest in technology. The COVID-19 pandemic has actually just shown a lot of weaknesses in terms of how we utilize technology, the infrastructure that we need. But it's not just any form of technology, it's got to be local technology. And I think here we're beginning to see some of the private sector companies working with non-profit organizations to strengthen their ways of working, but also building on local technologies. I have an example of Vodacom, for example, in South Africa that works very closely with a number of non-profits in either promoting education or skills transfer, among others. And I think this is something that we really need to be thinking about. So these would be some of the areas that I would think philanthropy would have to take risks in. In fact, I actually see them as huge opportunities for me.
Thanks, Becky. Hearing a lot about the importance of relationships across sectors, but also with nature. When working with communities, don't try to turn them into what you are. They're not what you are. But also the importance of building African resources and capabilities for African philanthropy around knowledge, data, storytelling, human resources, technology, etc. Thanks so much. Coming now to Sasha for a second question. Following up on your discussion about sort of local resilience, etc., and localization, community-driven philanthropy. What are some things moving forward that African philanthropy can dare to do differently to ensure and to build upon resilience?
Thanks, Matt. And yes to everything that Becky was just saying. Absolutely. And I want to uplift one of the things that he said and just reiterate how important his point on investing in civil society and movement building work in the region. There should be way more resources going to locally led organizations doing critical work in civil society movement building. And there's not enough open capital. There's not enough flexible capital for them to do the programs that they want to do. So I think that's kind of, I just appreciated that point so much. I wanted to also agree on that point. Yeah, I think that generally in terms of like moving forward, this will be created by African philanthropists who like envision collectively what their future looks like. And I think there's a few things that, I hope it, don't make it look like Western philanthropy. There's so many things that Western philanthropy have messed up, and we don't need that reincarnated. So I'm excited to see what comes out. I think some of the things that I have seen in the region that I hope more will happen there, to kind of go along with this note of let's move towards community-driven work where every community has the right and the power to make the decisions in their own community moving forward. what philanthropy is going towards, how power is structured. Kind of within that, there's three things that I have just been blown away by. One is that some organizations and some of our own work lean into pre-colonial organizing practices that are really built on the collective model. And these are so important for the world to remember what those pre-colonial organizing practices meant to human connection, human capacity together, to inspire each other, to move forward together, to make progress together. And those pre-colonial organizing practices we draw from things like Ubudehe, Umuganda, and Mihigo in Rwanda. There are similar ones in regions nearby. There's a lot of power there that can kind of be reintroduced. And I hope to see more and more of that. I think that there's a lot of lessons there, not just for the region, but again, for the region to then kind of teach the rest of the world and inspire the rest of the world to remember the power of community through those organizing practices, and of course update them for today and how we want to make them equitable for our current world. The second is the collective versus the individual. I think one of the most classic tensions between how kind of Western organizations work and how organizations in the region work is that the West is like over individualized, and there's immense power in the collective. And the folks who were opening up the conference spoke to the power of collaboration and working together to create more movement into how to bring philanthropy forward. And I hope that has kind of like that mimics what community-driven development might look like at the village level, kind of upwards into the levels of how philanthropists work together to move something that might be like a Pan-African movement for philanthropy forward that then can be promoted to the rest of the world as well. That collective identity is so important and so much more impactful than the individualist way, which kind of isolates people and doesn't recognize the power of connection for progress. And then the third thing is, I think a lot of historical work or in the last few decades, there haven't been a lot of great solutions on the equity side. And there's calls for greater equity now, but I think that there's a lot of solutions in the region for how to build a more equitable model for distributing capital to people who should have access to that capital, and for decision making. How do you have more equitable decision making into how funds are being used or who's advocating for what to government? And that equity piece, again, the world needs it, and I think it will be born in East Africa, what the rest of the world needs to hear. So I'm hopeful that both the leaning into pre-colonial organizing practices, embracing the collective, and building for inclusion will propel a model for community-driven development that will be a East African and maybe a Pan-African model that the rest of the world can learn from as well. And I take no credit for any of those ideas. I've learned them all from colleagues in the region that I've been inspired by many of them.
Thanks, Sasha. So hearing about the need not just to build resources and capabilities on the continent, but also to look to what we already know about collective organizing, around generosity, around, as Jackie said earlier, storytelling around fireplaces or under the trees. And thank you. So returning to Jackie, another question for you we have is with the emerging realities, what are some of the things that African philanthropy can dare to do differently in telling its story? So kind of building upon your previous answer, where do we be bold? How do we be audacious?
I think part of it is two things in my mind. One is when you seek to tell a story, you need to understand whose story you do not yet see. And so part of storytelling is asking yourself, who is outside my peripheral vision that I need to see and that I need to hear? Because that's the twin of how you tell stories. You see differently and you also listen differently. And part of it will take closing our mouths for a few minutes. Because I think even in trying to tell people's stories, there's a danger in inserting ourselves into the narrative, or like I said, there are oftentimes, people who speak local languages will tell you it's very hard sometimes to translate into what has become the mainstream languages. So how do we keep true to the narrative of what we are hearing? So I think a new way of storytelling is literally, how do we see differently? How do we recognize the log in our own eye and remove it so that we can see more clearly? And I think each of us needs to ask ourselves, who am I not seeing? And what is that journey towards seeing different, seeing better? And who am I not hearing? And how do I unclog my ears to hear better? And that will take a lot of humility if we go back to what Professor Moya was talking about in terms of what are the values we infuse even as we do storytelling, right? And critical to those values is humility. Because I'm not, again, if you think about, we're not creating communities to look like us, we're also not creating stories to look like ones that we are used to hearing. So we need to really listen with humility, and so that things don't get lost in translation. And yeah, so for me, those would be the things: seeing differently, hearing differently, and listening truly with humility, because we do not know all that there is to know about giving and generosity in Africa. I think the other way is then, how do we even begin to tell the true story? When we're telling the story of giving and generosity, we must also understand that we're only telling part of the identity, because Africans are thinkers, are innovators, are leaders, are also generous, right? And there might be a temptation to fixate on one thing and then, go down the path that Chimamanda calls the danger of one story. So how do we still, as we locate stories of giving and generosity, understand that this is a context, right? And we are seeing the African person or African philanthropy as a whole, embedded in community, embedded in Ubuntu, as Sasha was saying, embedded in how we relate to nature, as Moya was saying. So it's all of these, that the story doesn't hang alone as though it has no rooting. So it's understanding the roots of the story, it's hearing differently, seeing who we don't see, and listening with humility.
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's a really important message to every single one of us who's here this morning, that we need to think about our role. What are we not seeing? What are we not hearing? And that there's not and never will be a story of African philanthropy. How do we let those multiple stories emerge? And that means that might mean doing less and sort of stepping back rather than doing more. We have some really fantastic questions that have emerged in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. We've got about 15 minutes left, so try to keep answers sort of relatively brief, and maybe, in some cases, I think I'll pose the question to one of you, but then if others want to chime in, please come in afterwards. And so I think I'm going to start by asking a question that's been proposed to Professor Becky, and that is, how can African youth, you spoke about the youth dividend, how can African youth get more involved in philanthropy and play a role in this revolution or audacity that we're talking about?
Okay, thank you very much. I think to begin with, I would say the African youth are already involved in philanthropy in many ways. So let's begin by, just defining what it means to be philanthropic. To be philanthropic means giving of anything, your time, your networks. You could be a recipient of philanthropy as well. And so, I wrote several years back that you are a philanthropist before birth, at birth, during your lifetime, and when you die. And so young people must not, isolate themselves and think that philanthropy is something that is out there, that they must aspire to become. They are already philanthropists by virtue of being alive and being around people. So that's the first. The second is that research actually is increasingly showing that young people are fascinated, but they are more interested in their future than some of the older people. And so that means if asked to be involved in different acts of solidarity, of giving, of care, young people are always in the forefront to actually want to give of their time, resources, and so forth. And so research is already telling us that young people are actually involved, but even more likely to give than others. And so what do young people want? What future do they want? I think for me, giving has to be very strategic, but it also has to mean something to the giver and to the recipient. So young people want a sustainable future. Young people want a continent where they can find jobs, dignified jobs, so to speak. They want an economy that is beneficial to everyone. They want a society that is inclusive, and so forth and so on. They shouldn't wait to be invited. They should create the spaces to be part of the solutions and the future that they want to be. And so my view is that young people are organizing across the continent. Young people are doing phenomenal things across the continent. Perhaps what we need to do is to go back to this movement building thing that was mentioned by Sasha and see how young people can forge this movement and come up with it. I know there are several movements of young people across the continent, but perhaps we're thinking of a continental movement that could galvanize them together, but also infuse the idea of philanthropy. So let me tell you that the idea of philanthropy and Pan-Africanism are interrelated. If you go to the Monrovia Declaration of 1979, when the member states came together and made that declaration, they were talking about how Africa could be self-reliant, how Africa could be united, how Africa could be in solidarity. And all the institutions that the heads of states came up with at that particular moment in time were geared towards building this unity, building this inclusivity, and building this solidarity among nations. And if young people really want to be involved, let's go back to basics, like I said. Go back to the Monrovia Declaration, look at the different spaces that were created for everyone to be involved. But secondly, wherever you are already a philanthropist. Do what you can to just change one little thing at a time.
It's great. Thank you. Yeah, and I think it comes back maybe also to what Jackie was saying earlier about seeing what we're not already seeing. If we see philanthropy as a group of organizations involved in philanthropy, then we're not going to see these movements as clearly as we should. Jackie or Sasha, do either of you want to come in on this question, or shall I?
Just to reiterate that young people are already giving. One of the ways through which we tell stories is through a podcast, our podcast called Community. And actually this season is dedicated to telling stories of young people giving. And it's amazing. It blows my mind all the time. It's a weekly podcast. And yeah, just tune in and listen to just the ways in which young people are creating solutions for their communities. It's already happening. It really is.
Great, wonderful. A recommendation. Thanks, Jackie. The next question.
Can I chime in with uplift one thing that I've seen in Rwanda, which I think the government has done a beautiful job on? There's so many young folks who want to take action, that want to create change in their community, right? But we don't always formally create a space for them to do that. On Village Leadership Committee, it's usually folks who are older. It's, how do young folks start stepping in? And Rwanda has done this remarkable thing where they've opened space for 2 young people to be elected by residents to go into leadership at the village level and facilitate community meetings, to be kind of like the community facilitator and cheerleader. And I just think that's fantastic to open up this space so that young people who are already doing great work get a little bit more recognition and leadership for it. And kudos to the government.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question that I've seen come onto the from the delegates is around gender and the role that women have to play in the future of in this future that we're talking about. There's been a lot of work, and there continues to be a lot of work done on gender inequality. But what does societal transformation look like in African philanthropy moving forward? How can we move to the next level in terms of breaking glass ceilings, etc.? The question was put specifically to Jackie, but I again encourage others to come in.
And I will use a story making frame. In about 2019, when we started hitting the streets of Kampala and asking everyday folk about giving and givers and philanthropy, we would often ask people to name, a philanthropist they know. And often, sadly, it was Western, male, mostly white, right? And then last year we did a study in 5 districts across Uganda. And again, when you congregate people in a focus group discussion, often when you ask who are givers in this community, we found that more often than not, communities mentioned men. So we started to ask ourselves, is it that the ways women give are invisible? Do we not see them? Is it that, what is it about women and giving that does not get into the public space? And so if and when we get money, we would love to do a research on women and giving. So that is one, because also when you come from this continent, you have a sense, you have a feeling that surely women give, if not more, equal to men. So it's just why is it when we do the data, their stories are not emerging? What is that about? And so how do we hear them more? How do we see them more? Is it that they don't access, their stories don't get told? Is it that they still, even for all the work we've done around advancing women's rights, that there are still ways in which women are invisible in this space that we haven't yet been attuned to? So there's a lot of work to do in just recognizing, honoring, celebrating, pinpointing, highlighting the vast and varied ways that women give. Just to go back to the example I gave about the AIDS scourge, I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of grandmothers across this continent were now the caregivers, long before UNAIDS, long before all these organizations. And they were the ones that carried our communities, that carried the orphans. But maybe what we will see are the people that build the schools for orphans, and we will not recognize the mothers that are taking these children to school. So it's just, again, seeing women as givers, acknowledging that they give probably differently and probably several layers behind the scenes, and going back there and surfacing these stories.
Thanks, Jackie. Becky or Sasha, would you like to add to that at all?
Let me just add something quickly. As you were speaking, Jackie, I was reminded of an email I received a couple of days ago. There's an organization that has requested I say a few words about one of, what I think is one of the most wonderful, powerful, and probably the most knowledgeable woman leader in philanthropy in Africa. But the award says is they recognize an invisible giant. And it got me thinking, why an invisible giant? And maybe it's my interpretation of what they mean. But for me, this person is so visible, is so powerful. If I mentioned their name here, everyone would be like so shocked why we are calling an invisible giant. I think it's got to do with framing. It's got to do with definitions. There's no contestation that in every society, we know that women are the most giving. We know that from giving birth, to life, to everything. So there's no doubt about that. How come when it comes to telling our stories, we then silence that part of our knowledge and say, women are not giving? Research also shows that women actually give a lot, and they give more than men. Basically, it's just that because of the economic structures and otherwise, we then tend to focus on the financial elements of it. And again, I mean, you know how it works. If most women were to divorce right now, we would actually get to know how much they give, because they are separated from their men. We got to know about Mackenzie Scott and all others simply because they've been tied to their men, right? You separate them from the men, then you get to hear their stories. So I think that as we talk about re-engineering philanthropy and all of that, we also need to really be true to ourselves and begin to tap into that which we know and not silence things that we know about. So we know women give. We are all products of women to begin with. So let's start there and tell the stories the way they're supposed to be. One of the things that we have done at CAPSI, we've been around and working at a business school with everyone. We took it for granted that people would know what we're talking about. But we quickly realized that there was a need for us to create a specific space for women in philanthropy. And so we started a series of webinars now where we are just having a space only for women to talk about philanthropy and the work that they do without any limitations or whatsoever. And that is helping us as the center to develop a program that will focus on women in philanthropy, because we know and we have realized that their stories are silenced. Therefore, let's create those specific spaces where women can come together and address that.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a number of really interesting questions that have appeared in the chat, but we are running close to the end of the session. So what I'd encourage you to do as delegates, everyone, not just the panelists, is to go in and take a look at some of those questions and comment on the platform in response to them, because we have so many people here with really great ideas and with incredible experience to bring to the table. So definitely encourage you to do that. In closing the session, what I'd like to do is invite the panelists to share. There's one question here about how we move beyond rhetoric and take actionable steps to achieve a difference, to make an achievable difference. And so I'd like to ask you as panelists to share one actionable step that you'd recommend to delegates, as they go out from this conference over the coming days and weeks. So one actionable step looking forward. Thank you. And we'll go in the same order. So Becky, if you go first, then Sasha, then Jackie.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to have been part of this conversation. It's always very exciting, but also an honor for me to be invited at this platform. I think for me, I don't want to challenge people with things that are beyond their means. A flower blooms where it is located. A flower blooms where it is located. You don't take the flower and put it somewhere else and expect it to bloom. So wherever you're located, whatever you're doing today, do it better, do it well, do it with the vision and thinking that you are contributing to human improvement. So if I'm doing research and I'm focusing on philanthropy, let me do my research to the point that it contributes to the development of humanity. If you're doing grant making, do that. If you're doing youth engagement, do that. Bloom where you are. Don't try to take yourself out of your conditions. Your conditions are the best place for you to actually be what you are.
I am just so thrilled by the power and momentum in this network, and feel so much gratitude for it. And I have no unique thoughts other than to say that Jackie's words before were so beautiful around seeing and listening in a deeper way, to be present with folks, with people's stories, with experiences. And so, Jackie, thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to take that as my takeaway and remind folks about that.
One thing you can do, you are a story. I don't think there's an African here who can say they've never been a product of giving or receiving. So it's cyclical. And so pick up the phone. Tell your story, or enable through your phone others to tell their stories. Go around and record these stories. We have a tool in our hands that we can use. And we wish you well. And send those stories. I know Becky is starting a storytelling platform. Send them to Sipsworth. Send them to Sasha. Let's generate. They are there. Let's find them, record them, send them, so that we can all hear these beautiful stories of philanthropy.
It's wonderful. So tell your story, listen to the story of others, and bloom where you are. Thanks so much to our panelists for joining us this morning and sharing their experience and insights. It's been really wonderful to hear from all of you. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Arungu, who's going to take us forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, Sasha, Becky, Jackie, and Fiona for that session. And Becky, I was touched by your comment about flowers grow in specific contexts. There's a poem by Nikki Giovanni. For those of us who are kind of under the, let's say, the millennial or the Generation Z section, and maybe even not that, Tupac Shakur used it. I'm just going to read a little bit from it because I think it's such an empowering poem, and you may take a moment, all of us, to just look at it. So Nikki Giovanni wrote this poem, right? And she said, "When no one even cared, the rose grew from concrete. It kept all those dreams, proving nature's laws wrong. It learned how to walk without having the feet. The rose grew from concrete." And it's such a powerful statement. Of course, when she was writing it, she was talking very much about, Black oppression. She was talking about the lack of an enabling environment for humanity to grow in the context of systemic racism. But she talked about these roses that grew from the South and, the North of America, where there was high levels of racism. So we're going to take a break in a few minutes. Let me just test the system. So we're going to break for 5 minutes, a comfort break. We'll have some entertainment in the background. We will not come back into the plenary. We will go into the breakout sessions, and you should be able to see in a few minutes or a few seconds, they will put up some options of the 3 breakout rooms. And let me just frame the breakouts clearly for us. The first breakout session is titled "Community Philanthropy Isn't Coming, It Has Arrived." And we have a number of great speakers led by Gerald Kankwa that will lead this particular breakaway. The second breakaway session is titled "Reimagining Grant Making in East Africa Through a Decolonization Lens." And Sibongile Ndashi, Mai Banka, and Andrew Karagai will lead that conversation. And the session facilitator for that session is Maria Alessi, who will take that breakaway. The third session is, if I can scroll down here, is on collaborations for community philanthropy and building resilience, a case for Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And that breakaway will happen simultaneously with the other 2 and will complete once at 12:15, at which point we will take another break, and participants will use the same technology to break into the 2 parallel breakaway sessions that will take place between 12:15 and 12:20. And of course, I am speaking in East African time zones. For the rest of you, please do the magic that is required to know where you need to be at what time. And hopefully it's not too complicated. The next round of breakaway sessions, there are going to be 2 of them. The first will be on wellness and well-being. How do we energize philanthropy into the future? And Nelly Kinyanjui, a wellness coach and wellness leader, will take us through that breakaway. And then simultaneously, we will have Ken Mijungu and Janet Bogwa and Hagai Matsiko, who will take us through a session on the media and philanthropy. So this is what's ahead of us before we come back for a summary and a wrap up and essentially a reminder of what is in store for us the next session, which will be the next day, which will be tomorrow. Evans, I believe that is the task ahead of us. Let me invite the technicians or you to give us guidance and the options of going into the breakaways. Thanks again, Becky, Sasha, Reed, and Fiona, and Jackie. We'll just wait for the options to come up on our screen.
Yeah, we are posting the links shortly, Irungu. Thank you.
We wait for the links to come up. Let me remind you again, please tweet, post, TikTok, Instagram, and all the other things that are now available to us. If you are inspired, write a blog and share it. And again, we're using the hashtag #EA Philanthropy.
Irungu. So what the delegates can do is click on stage, on the stage button that's on your left. At that, they'll find the 3 breakout rooms, which they can now select the breakout room to join.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Okay,
before that,
you're muted there,
so I was
Evans.
saying that before that, there is entertainment for the guests, which will take less than 5 minutes. Then after the entertainment, you can go to the stage and pick whichever session makes a lot of sense for you. So thank you.
Travel safely. I hope you've all had your PCR tests and that you don't get stopped by immigration as you move into the breakaway session. Kayamba, take us out. And once again, we will go into the breakaways. We'll start in 5 minutes. We invite the technicians to switch on the cameras. To unmute Kayamba. We're still unmuting Kayamba, and I hope some of you I can see have begun to go into the stage. Into the stage and into the rooms. We will be starting the rooms in the next 3 to 4 minutes. And again, those rooms will run until quarter past 12, quarter past the hour. If Kayamba are overwhelmed by technology, Jackie Asimue and myself will do a double act. I will sing and or play music, and Jackie will dance. Oh, maybe Evans will sing.
Irungu. The live link for the entertainment guys as a challenge. They are trying to sort it. That's the same challenge we were having with the live presentation in the morning.
Over 500 events. Due to COVID-19 restriction, we come to do in a way of virtual.
Mark Gideon, if I can ask you to mute yourself on that end.
Patriotic song about Kenya.
Thank you, bro. Evans, do you want us to go into the breakaways?
Yeah,
I can see a number of people have gone into the breakaways.
I think
why don't we do that?
Let us get into breakout. You just need to go to stage and pick the session that is of interest to you, and then we should be able to move. So just go to the stage, the left side of the screen, top of it. Then there are 3 breakout sessions there. You can click of whichever session you want to join in. So there's the first one on community philanthropy isn't coming, it's here. The next one on collaboration, and then reimagining grant making. So the live links are live, so you just join any. Thank you.
Safe travels, everybody. Enjoy your breakouts, and we'll see you at 12:15 in the other breakout session. So you'll go straight into the sessions.
Thank you.
We come back to you after the morning session. We hope that you've enjoyed yourself. This afternoon, in front of you, we've got Kayamba music. Kayamba music, they sing contemporary African music. You remember at the East Africa Philanthropy Awards, Kayamba music were the main performance in that event. So far, we've done over 500 events due to COVID in a way of virtual. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to sing one item, a patriotic song about Kenya that speaks about the importance of us having unity and pushing the wheel of development together. In front of you is Kayamba music. Thank you. Mwenyezi Mungu mwenye pendo na nguvu za ajabu, ametuumba kwa mfano wake na akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. O Mwenyezi Mungu mwenye pendo na nguvu za ajabu, ametuumba kwa mfano wake na akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. Kwa hiari ametupatia lugha za ajabu, tamaduni mbalimbali, akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. Kwa hiari ametupatia lugha za ajabu, tamaduni mbalimbali, akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. Mwenyezi Mungu mwenye pendo na nguvu za ajabu, ametuumba wake na akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. O Mwenyezi Mungu mwenye pendo na nguvu za ajabu, ametuumba kwa mfano wake na akatuweka Kenya nchi nzuri ya ajabu. Na kwa hiari ametupatia lugha za ajabu.